Cool. Well, welcome everyone. Hopefully you all can see and hear me. Welcome to all of you, but especially to our guest, Afua Hirsch and the JDWC team. Very excited to see you all here today, and so pleased and proud to kick off our Black History Month. I'm going to give a very quick introduction, and then I'll pass over to Imran, who's going to do a more formal introduction to Afua Hirsch. First off, though, I want to welcome some of our guests. We've got guests today from various employee resource groups at some fantastic companies. Willis Towers Watson, the leading global advisory, broking and solutions firm. AIG, the global insurance and finance corporation. BP, the petrochemicals company, one of UK's largest companies. And Nike, the global supplier of sportswear and footwear. We welcome you all. Thank you so much for joining together with us on this. Black Khan is so pleased to be forming this relationship with you, and it's really good if we can build a relationship with the diversity networks of your firms. I think we can together really make the world a better place, and that's our aim. We want to pool our ideas, work together, and see if we can drive change on a larger scale. So thank you for working with us on that. We're also very pleased to welcome YDWC, the debate organisers. Very excited to work with them. YDWC are a professional network of people from diverse cultural backgrounds, and they've been on the forefront of leading conversations on race between employees and employers. So welcome everyone. We've got lots to do today. First, we're going to have a keynote speech by the renowned Afua Hirsch, followed by Q&A, and there's a Slido for Q&A. I'm sure people can find that soon, and we'll flag that out. Then we're going to have a debate by YDWC, the motion being, this House believes that it is better for ethnic minorities to emphasise their similarity with the majority populations as a strategy to improve their lives. And finally, any of those that are physically here in our Kearney offices, we're going to have drinks and nibbles afterwards and a bit of a networking event. For our people that know, you know well that Kearney has been pushing this open dialogue on race. We think this is a really good way to push this. So we encourage you all to be open-minded, participative, enjoy the debate. It's not about winners or losers on a debate. It's about the discussion and what you experience and what you learn as individuals. So please listen, be reflective, and do ask questions along the way. Sometimes it's not easy for people to have discussions about race, and I appreciate it's complex. And we encourage this, and we allow what's called clumsy conversations, where questions or comments that are made respectfully sometimes don't come out quite right. And the ambition really here is to build the dialogue and the learning. So please treat all of this as a respectful, safe place. Top priority really is to get your questions out, listen, enjoy, but really learn and increase your awareness. So please enjoy it, please participate. And with that, Imran, I'm going to hand over to you.
Andrew, thank you, and welcome everyone from me, Imran Dasu, a partner at Kearney. Those who have been working with me over the last few weeks in planning this event and planning this speech know how excited I am, how excited we all are to welcome Afua Hirsch as our special guest speaker today. It's truly an honor for us. Afua is a writer, she's a TV presenter, a documentary maker, and a former barrister. She was born in Norway and she was raised in London, where she lives today. And she describes her passions as the African continent, human rights, and storytelling. And for me, I guess the intersection is her commitment to call out and make sense of the injustice and unfairness that she sees in the world around her. She was called to the bar in 2006, and she initially represented people on legal aid who couldn't afford the representation that others could. she wanted to actually expand that and communicate their struggles to a much wider audience. So Afua actually joined the Guardian newspaper to do that as their legal correspondent. She then moved to Ghana to cover West Africa. And in 2014, she joined Sky News as their social affairs editor. More recently, she now today is an accomplished writer. She writes documentaries and recently wrote African Renaissance, which was a major BBC series. Also, that one was on African art, and she wrote one on called Enslaved, which was a 6-part series about the history of transatlantic slavery, which she co-presented with Samuel L. Jackson. And if you haven't seen it, it is still available on iPlayer, and I do commend it to you. I particularly found harrowing the scenes of Elmina Castle in Ghana. And it wasn't so much the numbers, which are astronomical and hard to comprehend, quite frankly, but the names and the personal stories of those who were enslaved that I found really, really moving. She writes for newspapers, she writes reports. Her recent book, which was a bestseller, is really nicely titled Brit-ish, on race, identity and belonging, and it was the winner of the Royal Society of Literature Jerwood Prize. So with all these achievements, it's pretty unsurprising, right, that she's recognized as one of the top 10 most influential people of African heritage in the UK, and that's a 2021 Power List. A lot of themes we're going to cover. Efua's going to cover a lot of powerful themes, I'm sure, but I'm going to leave you just with an apt quote from our previous guest, David Olusoga, who on Efua's book wrote that it was written with passion, not anger, insight rather than resentment, on the issues of race, identity, and the multiple meanings of Britishness. This is the book for our divided and dangerous times. And if you ever wanted to know how it feels to be repeatedly asked the question, or if you don't know what I mean by the question, then I encourage you all to read the book. Afua, a warm welcome from us, from all of us here. In terms of questions, we are going to be using Slido, so everybody please enter Slido using your phones or your laptops. Do make notes, and at the end we've got lots of time for Q&A with Afua. Afua, thank you for being with us and for sharing your thoughts. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Imran, for that incredibly thorough and comprehensive introduction. I'm actually not sure I could have introduced myself as comprehensively as you did. And thank you, Andrew, as well. It's a pleasure to be here. Before I speak, I thought it might be useful to show you a video that really summarizes the work that you just referred to in my book, Imran. So here that is. Our country is at a pivotal moment. But do we know our own identity? It's a simple question, but where are you from? I grew up here in Wimbledon. But naming Britain as my home wasn't always enough. It was as if the way I looked required a longer explanation. There weren't many other people around here who looked like me, and I faced a constant struggle, trying to pretend my otherness didn't exist, attempting to fit in. I spent my whole life wondering, is this really my country? Is this truly where I belong? As a teenager, one of these shops made it clear that I was not welcome, even though my best friend worked here. That told me that there was something taboo, problematic and unwelcome about my identity. I've traced my family history and it's changed me. My story is part of Britain's story. I grew up around here and my family history is linked to this place too. Robert Baden-Powell sat right here by this windmill to write Scouting. This is where the Boy Scouts, that most British of traditions, was born. But right before that, Robert Baden-Powell chased my Ghanaian ancestors from their homes. They lost everything. Britain has shaped my family's history. It's a nation of unanswered questions, of avoided subjects, of contradictions. And as a nation, we still refuse to shine a spotlight on race and identity, or to explore the murky depths of our relationship with those who look visibly different. Why don't we ask those questions? What is it we're so afraid of?
I've been finding out more about Britain's story and my story, exploring my identity whilst delving into our history. It's too often swept under the carpet, washed away with phrases like, "I don't see race." But it's always there, bubbling just under the surface, shaping how we view others and ourselves. Did you know there were Africans here in Great Britain before the English arrived? The Anglo-Saxons were immigrants. Your ancestors, like mine, were immigrants.
I'm English and British.
I'm Jamaican and I'm from Brixton.
I'm Portuguese and I'm from Lisbon.
I am totally English.
I'm Canadian and I'm from Toronto.
I'm a black Brit.
Our individual stories tell us who we are. We should embrace talking about race.
My name is Afua Hirsch. My mother is from Ghana. My family were forced to flee the Ashanti Kingdom by Robert Baden-Powell in 1896. My father is British. My Jewish family fled Nazi Germany in 1939. I'm black, mixed race, and British. What's your story? Where are you from? Thank you. I hope today, and the reason that I'm motivated to speak to companies, individuals, nations about race, identity, and equality is because I want to contribute to the solution of how we can constructively move beyond the very racialized experience that we've had. But in order to do that, it is important to speak honestly and openly about that experience. And so just to elaborate on the work in my book, British, that you can see there, and the video you just saw, and to pick up from what Imran was saying about the question, I think it's really important to differentiate my experience from previous speakers that I know you've had here, such as David Olusoga, who I work with a lot, who's a really remarkable person and academic. But when I speak to people a generation older than me, they have very different stories of experiencing their blackness in Britain. Stories really of very violent, hostile racism. David talks of having bricks thrown through the window of his home growing up, of being chased down the street by violent thugs because of his race. That's really not my experience. I grew up in the 1980s and 90s. I grew up in a very affluent suburb, as you saw there in Wimbledon. And my life was not shaped by what I even regarded as racism at the time, because I think, like many of us, I didn't know what racism was. And I thought it was violent and criminal, hostile behavior towards people because of their race. My life was shaped by what I now sometimes describe as well-intentioned racism, which was expressions of othering and alienation that revealed that the people around me regarded my presence in Britain as something that did require an explanation. I've worked and lived in many countries around the world, but nowhere have I ever been asked where I'm from as much as I am in my own country. And just to tell you a little bit more about my family background and how that really shaped my perception as a child, both sides of my family are immigrants to Britain. My grandfather, as you heard there, came to Britain in 1939, having fled Hitler as a Jewish resident in Berlin, as an unaccompanied child refugee. He had absolutely no connection to Britain before the day he arrived here, penniless, with no English and a German name, which he understandably swiftly sought to change. And yet, within a generation, my grandfather's children, including my father, were allowed to assimilate into Britishness. And what I mean by that is that I've never heard anyone ask my father where he's from, as somebody who presents as a white British man. I've never heard him feel the need to explain his presence here or account for the positive impact of his family's immigration. On the other hand, my mother's family came to Britain also in the mid-20th century, having had centuries of close ties with Britain. Ghana, which was then the Gold Coast, was regarded by the British as their model colony on the African continent. Centuries of trade in gold, in enslaved people, and also centuries of exchange of people from the Gold Coast being educated in England, going back to work on the African continent meant that my family had been educated with the English education system, encouraged to look at Britain as their motherland. And yet, since my mother's family arrived here, they have never been allowed to assimilate into Britishness. And it's as a result of my African heritage and not my Jewish heritage that I am regarded as an ethnic minority who is still often asked to explain, even if in the most well-intentioned and friendly terms, what I am doing in this country. That's really the reason that I set about a project of understanding what the real content of Britishness as a perceived identity is. Why is it that I think in so many of our minds, even if subconsciously, it's associated with whiteness, this false idea of indigeneity, that there are the true inhabitants of these islands and that everybody who is visibly minoritized comes from somewhere else and arrived here recently. As I began to really try to understand what it was about Britishness, and this manifested in my case to give a simple anecdote, inability to describe myself as British. I would always hyphenate my identity. I'm Black British, or I'm British Ghanaian, or I'm British African. Some Black people I know have incredibly creative hyphenations that they use, like Afro-Saxon. Whatever it is, there seems to be a need to hyphenate. You can't just be British. And as I began to try and make sense of this and research, as journalists do, and I initially approached my book as a well-documented narrative nonfiction based on sources, I ultimately included more personal anecdote as I decided that I wanted to reach a wider audience. But I began a process of self-educating about Britain's history. And I say self-educating because as someone who regarded myself as well-educated, having been to a prestigious private school and Oxford University, it was humbling to realize how utterly ignorant and undereducated I was when it came to navigating contemporary Britain, but also understanding our history. One of the moments that really stands out for me, and if we could just look at the next slide, was a documentary also that you referred to, Imran, that I made with the actor Samuel L. Jackson, which sought to really delve into the history of the transatlantic slave trade. So I'll just play a clip of that before I talk about it further.
More than 12 million Africans were enslaved and trafficked. More than 2 million of our ancestors died at sea. The ocean holds stories that haven't been told.
This is ground zero for the whole transatlantic slave trade.
The story of the slave trade is world history.
It's not something unique to America. It was a worldwide phenomenon.
What we did in that series was try to counter one of the things that I think has really prevented us properly engaging with this history, which is hugely significant. And as you heard, their estimates of the numbers of Africans trafficked in slavery range from 12 million to 20 million, a veritable human holocaust in the millions who died as a result of the slave trade. And I felt that it's a history that I think we often regard as fairly abstract and a very long time ago. And the premise of this documentary series was to explore the Atlantic Ocean, because many people don't realize that the Atlantic Ocean is littered with the wreckages of slave ships. It's essentially a graveyard for enslaved people, for the ships that traffic them. Many of them sunk at sea under a range of circumstances, from storms to insurance scams to mutinies on the high seas, as enslaved people took their destiny into their own hands and attempted to overthrow the incomprehensible system that was now operating to own their bodies. And I thought that was important because we have been able to create this cognitive dissonance. And one of the consequences is that we don't understand the history that is very personal to many Black people, many of whom still have surnames that denote the legacy of the slave owners who had complete control over their lives and their financial destiny over generations, but also that there are legacies from that era that have affected our society at a very foundational level. For example, the reason that we talk about race, the reason that race exists, the reason that I would self-describe as Black or that somebody else might self-identify as white, is a legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. Race was very specifically invented as a concept to help justify what was an economically motivated transaction to allow Britain to become the global power that it is today. If we could just show the next slide. That led me on to a project of talking to people from a really wide range of identities about how the British Empire has affected them. And I think that we still see this as a story, to the extent it's acknowledged at all, that Black and brown people feel the need to discuss because of their own personal relationships to it. But one of the things that was important to me was to understand how many people who self-identify as white British have had their futures changed by the British Empire. There's barely a family in the United Kingdom, and research has proven this, that hasn't been affected by empire in some way. And one of the people I interviewed for this Audible podcast series was the sadly late actress Diana Rigg, and it was a real privilege to be one of the last people to interview her before she died. A real legend of the 20th century, from the Avengers to Game of Thrones, for anyone who saw her in that. And what I think people don't know about her is that her father was born a very working class boy in a northern town, and the only opportunity for social mobility available to him was to go and work in the empire, and he did. And as somebody who rose through the ranks in India, which was then the British Raj, he was able to propel his family up through the socioeconomic spectrum as a result of a system that still put him in a position of superiority to Indians and involved the exploitation of land, resources, and people's agency on that subcontinent. And it's something that Diana Rigg spoke about in a really nuanced way, because she is grateful for the opportunity that her family had to achieve social mobility, but has to also reconcile how unspoken about and how little discussed the complicated legacy of exploitation and appropriation that the empire has given us. If we can just see the next slide. For me, one of the things that has been obscured by our reluctance to talk about empire is a kind of complicity in the silence and erasure that regards people who come from formerly colonized parts of the world as inferior. And I say that because I didn't know until I began researching my book how many of the innovations in modern science, technology, and medicine, for example, come from indigenous communities in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And this that you can see here is one that really intrigued me. Fractal mathematics, which is the foundation for modern computing, is something that has been prevalent throughout the African continent for millennia. And scientists were absolutely shocked to discover, when they began taking aerial photographs of African villages or examining African hairstyles, patterns on African cloth, that the recursive patterns that form fractal mathematics are something that have been used as a form of decoration and ornamentation, but also social and political organization in many African communities. I think the really shocking thing about facts like this is the fact that they're shocking. And I think it really speaks to, in my case, the internalized prejudice that we still have against our own heritage, because I, like most of you watching, I suspect, have been conditioned with the British education system that, whether directly or subtly, conveys the idea that Europe, and Britain in particular, has a monopoly over Enlightenment values, over discovery and pioneering innovation and science. And because of the legacy of this prejudice, we're still very far from understanding what the true picture of our global state of humanity is, and the different ways in which diverse cultures have contributed to the progress we're able to make today. We could see the next slide. Last week, I found myself quite delightfully staying at University College, Oxford, with a friend of mine, Baroness Amos, Valerie Amos. Some of you may know her. She is the former leader of the House of Lords and High Commissioner in Australia. She's become the first Black master of a college at Oxford as University College, or head of house as she prefers to call it, because I'm sure I don't need to elaborate as to why the terminology master is historically pretty problematic. And looking at the images in her master's lodgings, it really dawned on me what it must have been like for her to be what I often describe as the first and only in almost every space that she stepped into. This is a photo of the members and officers of the Companions of Honor, which is kind of like the OBE on steroids. There are only really a handful of people who receive this honor, and this is them dining with the Queen at Hampton Court. And it's quite easy to spot Baroness Amos in the last row, because she's the only Black face in the entire gathering, and has been in many of the spaces she's inhabited. If we could play the next slide. And the difference it makes to have someone like her in her position at Oxford really made me reflect on my own time at the university, where I felt incredibly self-conscious about my otherness. As Zora Neale Hurston, the great African-American writer, said, I feel most Black when thrown against a sharp white backdrop. And in the absence of any other diversity, it's impossible not to feel highly racialized, highly visible, unable to have the luxury of being known for your interests or your contributions, because the perception of your race, it can be so overpowering. And to have not only another Black woman at Oxford, but one in a position of power and influence is really something that was unthinkable in my time at the university. And it's interesting to look at her legacy with a view to thinking about our experiences in workplaces and professional environments, because I think it really speaks to the multiple implications of achieving greater diversity at senior levels, not just at entry-level positions, because at the senior level, she's somebody who is able by her presence to send a message about diversity, opportunity, inclusion, who is able to do practical things. And as she has raised a huge amount of money for bursaries for students from underprivileged backgrounds and Black students, so that she will leave a legacy of much greater diversity in the college well after her time. But also, and this is important as well, if you look at the slide on the right hand here, dismantling the idea that this has always been a white space. And one of the things that she's done is to elevate the true history of University College, which includes the fact that it was home to the first ever Black student at Oxford, or the first known Black student at Oxford, Christian Cole, who arrived there from Sierra Leone in 1873. And again, had I known when I was a student there that the grandson of an enslaved African had studied there almost 150 years before my arrival, I think it would have helped me disrupt the idea that I was some kind of freak of nature by being a Black person who was admitted to the university, as my experience was. And his story also offers other lessons, because in spite of his opportunity to study at Oxford, and in spite of obtaining a degree in classics and going on to the bar, he was called to the bar at Inner Temple, he was unable to find work as a barrister. No one wanted to employ him. And I think the lesson from that is that having opportunities, being the first person in space is one thing, but finding an environment in which you're able to thrive, in which there are further opportunities, in which you're able to further climb and take advantage of the accomplishments you've achieved, is something different altogether. Moving on to the next slide, I have found a really wide divergence in the willingness of parts of the British establishment and British companies to be honest about these aspects of their own history and the history that makes up the history of Britain. It was really interesting to me to be part of a study at the Foreign Office a couple of years ago, in which they decided, quite counterintuitively, you might think, to be really frank about the history of racism in the Foreign Office. Until the 1960s, there was an official colour bar that barred people of Black or Asian heritage from even clerical roles, let alone the idea that they might become diplomats representing Britain on the world stage. And yet, half a century later, the contemporary generation of ethnic minority diplomats, who still are very few in number, spoke really honestly about the pressures they felt in the Foreign Office. And one of the things that they said was that even when there are Black networks, Afro-Caribbean organizations that attempt to create solidarity for ethnic minority people, they didn't feel comfortable joining them, because the culture in the organization was such, and as you can see here, that it made them feel they would be outing themselves as a member of the difficult, awkward squad, and that their success depended on demonstrating they were comfortable in a majority white establishment institution. The last thing this particular diplomat said he wanted to do was join the Ethnic Minority Action Group and draw further attention to the characteristic he felt was most likely to jeopardize his career, his Blackness. That for me is revelatory and really indicative of the real narratives I believe are still at work in Britain. And if we can see the next slide, this is something that has affected me quite personally. It's the idea that our presence in Britain is still somehow precarious and insecure, and that those of us who are allowed access to privileged spaces, elite spaces, establishment spaces, have been allowed to enter those spaces through some kind of act of generosity, in return for which we should be extremely grateful for having been tolerated. And I think it's worth taking a moment to think about the fact that tolerance is still really an official terminology that's used in our attitude towards ethnic minority people in Britain, furthering the idea that it's not ideal that we're here, but everyone's going to do the best to make the best of a bad situation. This is a story from at the Daily Mail, but it could have been any number of newspapers who found it unacceptable that somebody who'd been allowed into Oxford and the bar would use that education to offer a critique of Britain rather than emphasizing my gratitude for, strangely, not having been asked to leave the country, even though I have been British from birth. These, I think, begins to go to the argument that has not been won. I think many of us, individuals, organizations, governments, now have a solid understanding of at least the idea and the concept that diversity is something good. And the business case for the diversity is now well established. The moral case is something that's finally at least debated less. But where I think the battle has not been won is in the kind of cultural change that's necessary to create an atmosphere in which people can actually thrive being their authentic selves, not feeling that to give voice to their identity, their blackness, or whatever their own identity is, might make them a member of the, to quote the Foreign Office diplomat, difficult, awkward squad. And a few things that I feel have not been helpful in this respect, first of all, before I come on to what I think we can all do, is that this conversation too often places an emphasis on the visibly minority people in an organization. That furthers the idea that the lack of equality we have, the ongoing narratives that feed into racism, that this is a problem for ethnic minority people to solve, that we should be singled out and asked to offer solutions and to create change. Actually, this is a problem for everyone in society. If we want to live in a post-racial society, as I personally do, a society where your opportunity and outcomes are not, and access to resources, importantly, are not allocated based on your race, we have to see the extent to which we have been a racialized society. And if we could just see the next slide, another thing not to do is to create additional unpaid work for the Black and brown people in an organization, something that over the last year, so many professionals I've spoken to who have, on the one hand, voiced their optimism that since the murder of George Floyd, there has been a new opening of the space to have these conversations in the workplace, which they really welcome. But on the other hand, that many of them have been asked to, or felt compelled to, take on the additional burden of unpaid work to really drive this project of equality and inclusion forward on their own, in addition to their existing work. And it should be obvious to say that asking ethnic minority people to do additional unpaid work is not the path to equality and can't be. And the failure to address the pre-existing culture is something that I think it's really important to speak about, because we are comfortable now, I think, in many cases, with people of ethnic minority heritage talking about our own identities, although I think that's also really a very recent development. And for most of my life, it was perceived as a great taboo to talk about my heritage or my blackness. And the best thing that people thought they could offer me was a way out of it by saying they didn't see race at all. But we don't talk about whiteness as a cultural identity, even though it was invented alongside blackness and is as real a social construct as blackness, even though it has a history and a content. And in the case of the workplace, often has played a role in shaping the pre-existing cultural environment. Without being willing to see that and analyze and unpick what that content and context is, it's difficult to understand how it might affect people from different backgrounds stepping into the space. If we could just look at the next slide, we have to, as some anti-racism campaigners have said, lean into the racial discomfort that that conversation requires. Because if you are an ethnic minority person, you've had no choice but to live with racial discomfort. And if you want to be anti-racist, as this slide from Ibram X. Kendi reminds us, you have to be willing to conduct continuous self-awareness, self-criticism, and self-examination. There is no such thing as being not racist. You have to accept that if you do nothing, you are complicit in a system that has been unfair for generations, or you have to accept the idea of anti-racism and ask yourself in a candid and very personal way, and nobody can dictate this from the outside, what your anti-racism work can look like. If you just come on to the next and final slide, on the positive, there are so many more resources to help us do this work now. And when I was writing my book, just to return to a personal note, it felt like a very nuclear thing to do, to speak about my experience of race and identity in Britain. These were conversations I hadn't even necessarily had with my own family members, let alone on a national scale. And I was afraid that people in my life might cancel me for having the audacity to talk about my true lived experience and to tell historically documented facts about Britain's past that they're not used to hearing. And in some cases, people do react with that kind of fragility or hostility, but I feel many people are intellectually curious and really open to finding out how we can change and progress together. It is a process of constant learning, and no one is exempt for that. I include myself. I'm constantly on a journey towards better understanding who we are as British people and how we can solve the sometimes intractable seeming problems we've inherited from future generations. No one person can come up with a solution to that, but the important thing is to begin the conversation, create a space as you have today, where we can honestly and candidly talk to each other and work out what an inclusive way forward looks like. Thank you.
Thank you. For people that can want to come off mute and give a round of applause, because I think that was really spectacular. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. For honestly, it was magnificent, like eye-opening, thought-provoking, and there are a few points that really got me thinking. Number one was the remnants of the empire and the simple reason that racism exists as a legacy of a slave trade, and that it was specifically invented as a concept. It's really incredulous that the legacy has been so pervasive today, and it's important but hard-hitting to hear where it really came from. And then the second point that kind of resonated with me was the real incredulousness that we haven't answered these questions as Britain about our colonial past, despite our enormous hand in where this came from. And yet we managed to put such a scrutinizing spotlight on everyone else that's from a different background. It's really quite ironic. Really, hearing that story about that diplomat and how, the amount of sort of negative spotlight that's placed on those of color has managed to convince him that it's a bad idea to join this minority group is really quite scary to hear. But it's important for everyone to hear and important for everyone to understand that, really being inclusive is enabling people like that to join groups like that and be their true selves. But then finally, I think the point that resonated most with me was this concept of identity that you explore and where are you from? And it was at first refreshing to hear someone so eloquently and articulate phenomena and confusion that I'd experienced myself as a person of color, mixed race person, because you're absolutely right. Like African heritage, it forces you and your family to explain your existence in this country. The way you look just requires more explanation, more words than for everyone else. As a teenager, I wasn't one of the white kids, obviously, because of the color of my skin. But as a kick in the teeth, I wasn't even black enough because I listened to My Chemical Romance, which I trivialized the topic slightly, but the concept still runs true. Yeah. And this just, bodes this question of where do I truly belong, which honestly is not a question that anyone should be thinking as a teenager or at any point in their life. So I hear you, Afua, and thank you so much for exploring those concepts with us today. So what we're going to do now is we're going to jump into some Q&A. I have a few questions, and I'd also encourage all of you to submit questions via Slido. If you could post the link in the chat, Nick, or just flash up the code, that would be helpful. But we have a couple questions that have come through already. I think this first question is really interesting, which is, Afua, do you believe in the idea of immigrant optimism, and why yes or why no?
Thank you. Immigrants are optimistic. They wouldn't move here if they weren't optimistic. And they, I think I find really ironic is I think there's a general misunderstanding of who the people who've become immigrants to Britain are. And a good example of this is Gina Miller, who I'm sure many of you remember. She, born in Guyana, became the claimant in litigation that challenged the government's decision to implement Brexit without consulting Parliament. And she took on that litigation, even though there was a group of people, she became the face of it. And she was met with this very xenophobic and racist response, which said, how dare this upstart immigrant challenge our processes in Britain. And what I found remarkable is if you actually talk to Gina Miller or read her book, and she has written a book called Rise Up, I believe, she was born in Guyana as the most quintessentially patriotic, loyal British colonial citizen. You know, they used to drink tea in her house growing up in South America with doilies and teacups with members of the royal family. They celebrated royal holidays that we don't even know about in Britain. And the reason they came to Britain was because they were so indoctrinated with the idea of Britain's rule of law, democracy, superior values. And I think that conditioning explains why she conducted that litigation. She could not reconcile the behavior she was seeing with this esteemed idea of Britain that she'd been raised with. Now, whatever your view on Brexit, and I'm not seeking to open that can of worms, the point I'm making is that most immigrants, especially those with colonial backgrounds in their families, as so many of us have, are actually more conditioned into this idea of looking up to Britain and believing in British values. And I just always find it ironic, therefore, that we're regarded as having questionable loyalty or attachment to Britain. And I think, you know, again, it just speaks to the ignorance in Britain about Britain's own history. Salman Rushdie once said, you know, the British don't know their own history because so much of it happened overseas. And I think that's a really neat way of summing up the disconnect that exists between immigrant communities and their idea of Britain and people who consider themselves as indigenous British and their understanding of the people who come to this country.
Thanks, Afua. I completely agree. I think the dissonance is quite profound. We have another great question, actually, which I'll skip to, which is, so we're fortunate to be in a company with a voice, with resources. From your experience, from what you've seen, how can firms best demonstrate a commitment to diversity and inclusion? Do you have, what are some of the best examples that you've seen?
Yeah, so just kind of like elaborating on my talk, I think it's really important to look at entry-level practices, at recruitment, promotion, retention, but it's necessary but not sufficient. And I think that any company that conducts this conversation without looking at its most senior levels, board, C-suite, senior managers, can't really progress, because if you don't have people from diverse backgrounds in position of real power, executive power within a company, then it both is perceived as tokenistic, but also is really limited in its practical ability to create a change. And I think, you know, we're getting to the point where arguments that there is no talent from different backgrounds and that they're just, you know, that you'd love to have people in senior positions, but you just can't find them, is beginning to wear thin, because we're seeing how in good examples how it is possible. So I think that's often an uncomfortable conversation, but one that really needs to happen. In terms of cultural experiences, I think this conversation about what happens to the people of color in an organization, whether they feel able to bring their authentic self to work, whether they feel othered, whether they feel safe in voicing the practices or pre-existing cultures that have operated against them, is really important, because you can't encourage people to speak up about something if it's not safe for them to do so. And that leads me on to allyship, which I think, you know, as I said, this isn't actually a project for the people who are minoritized. This is a project for the people who self-identify as part of the white majority. And, you know, if you want to be a white ally, for want of a better phrase, one of the questions I would recommend asking yourself is, if you express allyship, are you actually risking anything? Because when people of color or minoritized people speak up or challenge something that they think is problematic, or even give voice to their identity, they risk a penalty, whether real or perceived. They risk a penalty that's attached to being different, being seen as not fitting, as being somebody who challenges. And that's something that I've experienced myself. You know, I've worked in so many professional environments, in the legal profession, newspapers, TV, in the political establishment. And I've seen it in every sector I've worked in, as somebody who tries to help with this project of furthering equality. So it's really important that people who are facing that penalty have allies who are willing to share the burden, and that burden has to be distributed equally. Otherwise, it's only perpetuating systems of unfairness. So I think that's something that also may be challenging, that people need to ask themselves: is there a penalty attached to people who challenge the pre-existing culture? And how can you share in that potential penalty? How can you share the risk and the cost?
I think that's a fantastic point. I think I challenge everyone here to understand how they can share the burden, and even our leaders to understand how they can sort of empower us to share, each of us to share that burden. I guess on a different note, but what's actually a really interesting question is, can you talk about the intersectionality of race and socioeconomic background?
Of course, it's really important and also complicated. So my personal experience, as I said, is I grew up very middle class. And one of the psychological challenges I faced was that I didn't feel that I could really have an authentic Black identity, because Blackness in Britain has historically been associated with lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And that in itself is an interesting story, because actually many of the African and Caribbean immigrants to Britain in the 20th century came from quite middle class backgrounds, but they were invited here on the condition of doing low wage, low skilled work. They were crowded into low quality housing. Their children were given access to substandard education. And, you know, one of the positive things is how much more research has been done on this in recent years. But there's nothing inevitable about Blackness and poverty, Blackness and low income. All of the unfair outcomes that Black communities in Britain still really do experience is something that was created in the years since they have been in Britain. I think that the way we frame the conversation about race and class is challenging, because, you know, we often talk about white working class as if to be Black and working class is a separate phenomenon. You know, the reality is that there are many Black people who are working class. The history is that many Black people have been part of working class communities and movements for centuries. And I include the trade union movement, activism against unfair industrial practices, political agitation for better conditions for working class people. Black people have been part of that movement and self-identified as part of the working class and working class struggles for a very long time. And yet they're still erased as a kind of separate community with its separate issues, which I think feeds into these ideas about degeneracy in Black communities, that Black people somehow aren't part of the respected working class, the legitimate working class. So there are lots of different narratives that aren't based on fact that we have accepted as such in Britain. And I think it's really important to start unpicking that. And a book I really recommend on that point is, Peter Fry's Staying Power, which analyzes the history of Black people in working class communities in Britain, among others, but also a book like Natives by Akala, which is his experience of growing up Black and mixed race and working class in Britain, and really challenges the kind of mutually exclusive ideas about race and class. And I think for somebody like me, just to end on a personal note, it's really important to say that I don't claim a monopoly over the Black experience. And I wrote my book actually with a full acknowledgement that I've had a huge amount of privilege relative to many Black people in Britain who haven't been given access to these spaces. But what I think we've also seen, and I wrote an article for the New York Times about this in respect of Meghan Markle, is that no matter how high up the socioeconomic spectrum you climb in Britain, as a Black person, racism will follow you. There is no level you can achieve, no level of success or social mobility or affluence or power that exempts you from the experience of being racialized in a negative way. So the idea that if we could solve class inequality, income inequality, we would solve racism is also clearly not the case.
That was great. I'd like to sort of blend another question in, which sort of asks something similar, but slightly more in a slightly more targeted manner, which is, could you talk about how the shame of growing up as a person of color in Britain leads to internalized racism towards first generation immigrants?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think if you look at the history of empire, the British Empire, and it was really British empires because there were so many different systems of power in different parts of the world. It was obviously a hugely vast geographic empire with such a vast diversity of peoples in it. But there was never a system whereby military force could contain the empire. It wasn't run through policing or armed forces or brute force anywhere. Those tools were sometimes used to repress and suppress rebellions. But on the whole, the British Empire was sustained by a process of mentally conditioning colonized subjects to believe it was good for them, that they were being given access to civilization through proximity to Britishness, and that aspiring to British culture, the English language, Christianity, and English education was by far the best outcome they could achieve. And so if you think about empire as a form of psychological domination, long after the borders of empire have disappeared and the force that did exist has gone, that psychological legacy is very real. And I speak as someone whose mother was born in the empire. My mother was born in what was then the Gold Coast, and she was educated in Ghana to believe that her ancestors were savages, their religion was pagan and satanic, and she would be, not at her school but at other schools like her schools, beaten for speaking English at school. And I think, you know, that's the person who raised me. So it's not a surprise that our generation, continuous generations, have inherited this idea that their traditional culture, their inherited religions and practices are shameful. They're the opposite of civilization, and that the best thing that could happen to them is to assimilate into what we believe to be white Britishness. So I think it's really important to see that. And you know, everybody, and I believe this so strongly, everybody has to self-identify with religion and culture and language and a story that speaks to them personally. You can't police people's identities from the outside. But what worries me is how many people, I think, aren't able to make an informed choice because their blackness, for example, is still portrayed as something problematic and inferior, and therefore the only rational choice is to try to move away from it. Just to finish with an anecdote that I share in my book, you know, my school friends, again, very well intentioned. I went to a school where I was one of very few black people. My white school friends once said to me, "Don't worry, Af, we don't even see you as a black person." And, you know, that was the first time this dawned on me, that in their eyes, and they were children, how could they know? They had inherited also this idea that blackness was undesirable, and the best outcome they could offer me was to move away from it. And I don't think that has changed in Britain, not least because we haven't been having honest conversations about its legacy.
I find that anecdote really rings true. And there's a really great question that I'm about to ask, and I'm going to preface it a little bit by sort of building on your point and positing that the question that, do you agree with sort of the kind of rhetoric that one would receive from their parents, you know, 10, 20 years ago? I know I did when I was younger, about this whole concept of you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. But yet, given what you've spoken about with regards to this conditioning, one would suggest that that's not the sort of thing that you want to hear. But knowing that you have a young daughter, and from all that you've experienced, how do you raise a black child in Britain today?
I think that as parents, one of the main experiences of parenthood has been for me the daunting reality of the lack of control that you have over your child's sense of identity, sense of their destiny. You know, that everybody, and I include children, will decide for themselves how they self-identify, what their sense of mission in the world is. But what I strive to give my daughter is a counter to the idea that she should be ashamed of her African heritage. You know, when she was born, I had an actual argument with her father about whether we should give her his surname, because he has a very quintessentially Ghanaian surname and it's double-barreled, and British people struggle to pronounce it. And he really felt that it would be better for her to have my surname, because then she wouldn't face the ostracism and prejudice that comes, you know, when you apply for a job, or you apply for a loan or a mortgage, or any of the things that people, and there's data on this as well, you know, you are likely to experience discrimination if your name is identifiably African. And I'm really proud to say we gave her that Ghanaian double-barreled name anyway, because I have to believe in a future in which she will be able to own that without facing discrimination. And that even if she does face discrimination, I think the psychological cost of being complicit in the idea that it's undesirable to have that name would outweigh the benefit of getting potentially that job or that mortgage. So I think it's important to be honest with our children that this history exists, but we don't do it in a way that tries to shrink them. On the contrary, we do it in a way that encourages them to take up space and to have pride in their own heritage, and also to educate their friends and allies. Because, you know, my great hope, and the thing we do have control over, is what her contemporaries will know and believe and have been educated in, and how much they will be able to be meaningful allies as they grow up together. And I think it shouldn't be the job of parents of color, of minoritized children, to do that. But if I have the ability to influence that in her life, of course I will.
Great, thank you so much, Afua. So that's what we've got time for today. There were a few more great questions on Slido. I'm sorry I didn't manage to get to those in time, but it was fantastic nonetheless. So yeah, on behalf of Carney and Black at Carney, again, thank you so much. It was spectacular. Again, I'm going to make everyone come off mute and clap because Afua deserves it. So please.
That's lovely to hear. Thank you for having me, and they were excellent questions, well fielded, Wesley. Thank you very much.